Hello everyone, welcome to Section 4, Unit 1. In this section, you'll be learning how to prepare your art for public display, how to preserve your art for future years to come, how to maybe promote your art, let others know and become more aware of you and your work, and then ultimately, the possibility of even creating a small business surrounding your work as an artist and as a graphic artist. One thing we want to make sure and cover before we begin this new section is that at this point within the course, you should be working on your final piece. In fact, you should be well into it. You should be struggling maybe with how to apply a certain portion of the composition, how the colors maybe interact with one another. You should be into drawing or putting together, composing your final piece right now. If you've not started your final piece, you are behind, so be sure and get moving and get to work so that this section makes sense to you and your work. Let's go ahead and consider this now before we begin about time management that we covered in the last section, and think about where you are in comparison of when the deadline is. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with Section 4, Unit 1, Preparing Your Work. Alright, so we're thinking about preserving your art. You've already finished your art, or you're in the process of finishing your art, so your final piece, after it's finished, needs to be prepared for public display. You can't necessarily just jump in and just share your work just as it is with the paint still wet. So we want to consider how to prepare and preserve your piece so that others can see it and enjoy it, but you can also have it in for future years to come. So we're going to start out by looking at acrylic and oil paintings. Now, the similarity between these two are that they both are a wet medium applied to a thicker canvas type material, so they dry in a certain way, of course oil taking longer. And we want to think a little bit about how to preserve and prepare these pieces of work so that others can see it and enjoy it, and it can be benefiting for the public in the future or yourself. Okay, so we first have to think about how oil and acrylic dries. It dries differently. Acrylic has a rougher surface. If you were to look deep down into the grooves of this particular picture here, into where you could actually see how the different molecules interact with one another, you would see that acrylics have small droplets of polymer. And the polymer is the binder of acrylic paints. Okay, so they join together to form one mass, and that's what you see on the canvas. Well, often what happens with acrylic paint is there's these little holes that form in these binders. Oil is different, it binds differently. Now after time, those little tiny holes will collect dust, different other things. Maybe if you touch it a whole lot, you're going to have problems with having oils from the hand. And what's going to happen is your painting is going to start to deteriorate. So what you want to do is think about how to preserve that. How are we going to preserve these paintings? Framing is one option. Sure, you could just put it behind glass, but there's UV aspects of glass. If you want to preserve it with just framing alone, you have to think about, well, is the glass UV protected? A lot of artists, though, move more towards this option, which is a type of varnish or a type of some sort of a polyurethane material that will actually be applied onto the surface. Now, how you do this is important. Now, if you're going to be working with polyurethane, it's a good idea that you understand a little bit about how to use it. Okay. Now, polyurethane comes in all sorts of various types of application options. You've got liquids, you got sprays, you got these types of gel, so on and so forth. Now, all of these are just fine to use, but you have to consider your specific need. Now, with the oil and acrylic, I would suggest brushing. The first thing you want to do is make sure you have a good brush. Okay, a flat nylon brush will, or something around 2 inches wide. You want to pour out some of the varnish gently onto like a small dish. You don't want to pour directly onto your canvas. And then what you want to do is you want to lay out some sort of a newspaper or something under it. Make sure your ventilation is properly considered, so you don't want to just start working inside of a small enclosed area, because that will get really bad really fast. The smells and fumes will get to you. You need to work quickly, but you need to work gently. Like I said, this stuff it dries pretty slowly, but the fumes and such will eventually start to get to you, even if you're wearing a mask. So I would apply it gently to the surface in even strokes, left to right, overlapping each stroke. So when you make one stroke, you want to be sure and overlap that with the other. You can see the difference here between the two sides. One's varnished, one isn't. There's a light glare on this piece, but you can clearly see where the varnish has been applied. Now, the brush that you choose is important, like I said, but you want to make sure that whenever you use this brush that you're not going to use it for other things. This is going to be specifically for this one use. Left or right strokes, broad strokes. Now you want to make sure if you use a spray, you need to also consider using a brush with that spray, because what happens is that you don't really have much of a control over how much is coming out, and so what you would do is actually spray and then take a brush, okay, and then gently brush over what you sprayed. Doing that will ensure that you have a pretty even flow of your polyurethane. So after varnishing, I usually cover my painting with a board larger than the canvas, and I'll rest it on it so that it props over and reduces the amount of dust that could get on the varnish layer, because that's a big problem. As this is drying, it can actually collect certain dust and other things coming around. So you don't really want that to happen either, because you're going to all this trouble to make sure that sort of doesn't happen, right? Now, pen and ink drawings, we want to take into consideration something here. With acrylic and oil, we're working with a thicker canvas usually, and that matters whenever you're thinking about preserving your art. Okay, it's a good idea to protect your pen and ink drawings when they're finished, because they could get dirt, dust, smudging. If the ink gets wet, that would be terrible. So you need to use maybe a spray varnish for this, or final fixative. Now we'll go over what those mean here in a second. But pen and ink drawings, are susceptible for becoming damaged. If you've worked so long to prepare something such as this, it would be terrible if a droplet came on. I actually have a story of this happening to me. I was carrying a piece of art in to be framed at a local store, and sure enough, one drop of water came down and just entered the protective plastic just so, and smeared completely down the drawing. So if you're thinking about using some sort of a polyurethane or a spray varnish to protect your work, you need to consider for sure how thick is your paper. Okay, a canvas being canvas, but paper is different. It comes in weights, so there's weights and thicknesses of paper. We talked about this in a past unit. You want to make sure that your drawing surface can hold the varnish, because the last thing you want is for your surface to become wet and then you end up actually destroying your work. Now, don't become timid about this. If you spray lightly onto a surface, you can get away with varnishing pretty thin paper, but I would test it out actually spraying onto a piece of paper similar to what you worked on, a small piece, and see how well it holds. Spray varnishes are really great to use. They offer UV protection, a lot of them, which means that your paper is not going to yellow over the years, which is really important, because that tends to happen to a lot of artwork, is that over the years they'll actually start to yellow. So you really don't want that to happen after you've worked so long and so hard to create something as amazing as what I'm sure you're creating, right? So if we take a look at a fixative, now a fixative is a little different than your actual spray varnish. It's basically what this is it's a type of polyurethane spray. It's a lot like the spray varnish, but they come in a little bit different methods of application. So there's, spraying this is going to cause you to have to approach your drawing in a different way. You can't just start lapping polyurethane onto your paper. You want to spray and then brush, spray and then brush. And you do this over and over until you get a good consistent layer of this UV protective polyurethane coating. Now, consider for a second colored pencil. Colored pencils are, you don't think, well, that can't smudge and And what's the need of actually preserving that? Well, they're likely to be affected by what's called wax bloom, especially if you have created layers and layers of colored pencil on top of one another. What that is this white haze. This white haze, and it appears over time as the wax medium rises to the surface. And it's over, a long period of time that this happens, but it causes this strange white haze. If like I said, if you use several layers of colored pencil, it will happen. What you can do with this, again, go to the fixative, and you can spray gently over top of your work. Some students, and I have even used hairspray in the past. So if you've worked on something such as this and you've got all this colored pencil layered on top of one another, you can use hairspray. I've done it in the past, but I don't recommend using hairspray alone, okay, because there's certain elements and certain chemicals in hairspray that actually will cause some damage if you don't have the right one. So you want to be sure that you have the right one, the right type of polyurethane to go on top, or the right type of hairspray. It's one of those things where you've worked so hard to create something such as this, and you frame it and alone. A lot of people think, well, that's it. But no, if you use polyurethane, a light fix, a spray, you can mat, and then you can put it in a frame, and it will hold for many years. Now, this alone, you can see, is a sort of a light box. It's actually not. What happens is here is that there's a mat there, and it's a raised mat. So the mat is up off of the surface of the paper. This is wonderful to do if you can, if you go on to actually frame your work after applying this varnish type of application to it. It's a good idea to raise the glass so that it's not touching directly to your artwork, okay? Because that over time can actually cause more damage. Now, lightly spraying on top of your color pencil or acrylic or even oil can work, but like I said, I highly recommend that you use a brush so that after you spray, you can get that coat nice and even. Brushes come in different sizes, so if you're working on a smaller piece and don't want to use the 2-inch brush, you can use a smaller brush, but just keep in mind, once you use this brush, you can't really easily go straight back into just dipping it in acrylic and oil and using it, because you have to clean it very well, and you have to use other type of solutions to clean the brush. So you can almost consider that brush being a specific use for polyurethane or fixative, and you can't really consider that brush anymore, I don't think, anyway, as being an art brush. Some can, some, but for me, I keep it separate. Now, watercolor. Watercolor is something that can become damaged pretty easily, especially because watercolor, when it dries, it takes a while to dry, but you can keep moving the pigment around on the paper, okay? But what happens is over time, your watercolor can actually start to yellow as well, and then you have a lot of trouble, with actually protecting it from some sort of a UV type thing, which will fade the colors out on watercolor. I would really avoid using any type of, and when you're mounting this onto a board for framing, any tape, okay, directly onto the surface of your canvas or your paper. It's okay to use the tape, of course, on the back. Now, some folks, this is actually, professions for people, is going in and restoring old paintings. What happens is they clean them. So they will use a very, very tiny brush, and they'll very gently go in and pull the dirt and grime and things off of these masterpieces. And if you look very close, you can see in this painting, about 3/4 of the way up, there's a darker line, that looks like the painting is faded or is darker. That's actually the dirt she hasn't removed yet. It's amazing what you can do in preserving your work. But if you preserve it well, you won't have this problem in the future. There are also small containers you can get of actually adhesive, not adhesive, but polyurethane varnish, so you can use that on top of your work with the brush. So there's options out there for you other than just grabbing a can of hairspray. Different types of brands as well. I'm not trying to promote any specific brand. Krylon is a very popular brand. If you're interested in finding an adhesive, maybe you want to use it in the future as well, then you can certainly find what you need with all these different options. Krylon clear polyurethane. Now you'll see that on this there's a shelf or a cabinet. Don't let that throw you off. You don't specifically need art Krylon. It's the same stuff. So if you were to go to Lowe's, let's say, or some department store and look for, polyurethane spray, or even liquid, you'll find it. It's there in tons of different options. But there are branded, some of them specifically for art. Of course, you do risk the option if you purchase like a brand that is specific maybe for wood or preserving, laminating, other types of stuff. You do run the risk of there being chemicals in there that aren't really good for art or paper or preserving. That is a risk. So there are brands out there specific for art. What you do not want to happen, though, is this, where you've worked so hard on your drawing and then you put the spray on and your paper starts to crinkle up. It would be an absolute tragedy. So, like I said in the beginning, be sure and test out what happens when you put this adhesive, not this, I'm sorry, I keep wanting to call it glue. There's a glue spray too, but when you put this polyurethane on your paper, test and see what happens. Okay, now we're going to move to graphite. This is actually a graphite drawing. This is a very cool narrative piece. If you look in the sunglasses, there's things going on. Let's say you just worked hours on a graphite drawing, cleaned up all the smudges around the drawing. Now, how do you keep it clean? So basically, we go back then to a fixative for your drawing. So some sort of workative fixative, so you can add layers to it. Once a drawing has been sprayed, the graphite underneath can't be erased, and it's fixed there. Graphite has a terrible reputation after you've worked so hard to complete something of being able to smudge it really good, and that's something you definitely don't want. Okay, shake the can really good before you spray it. My suggestion is to spray it probably, I would say, 10 inches from the drawing, 10 to 15 inches. Okay. But with the coating like such as this, I would not go with acrylic based polyurethanes for your graphite. So I would not use a brush onto the paper regardless, because what happens is if you spray too much, or if you wipe or brush too much of this polyurethane on your graphite, it will smear as you go. So you have to be very careful that it doesn't lift up portions and particles of your graphite. Spray about 10 to 15 inches from the paper. Put a nice coating. What happens is it turns really shiny. Okay, so your artwork becomes very, very shiny. And you don't, again, want to put too much on your work, because it will absolutely smear and it will mess up. So be careful and be aware of that. Okay, 10 to 15 inches. Give it a nice mist. If you can use a brush to go over it, that would be good. You'll notice that your entire drawing will become darker once you've sprayed it, and that's okay. It will darken, not darken in the sense of the paper, but of the actual graphite. It will become darker. So subsequent layers might be added too if you need to, preserve it, and in some areas didn't get enough, you may need to do that. Now let's talk a little bit about digital art preservation. Yeah, digital art preservation, believe it or not. Now, you can't go spraying polyurethane onto your computer screen, I know, but how do you preserve art? Now, what we have to consider is technology changes so fast. Technology is consistently changing. Digital technology is so imperial that an artwork created using, let's say, a G4 Mac, Flash 4.0 software, and C++ coding today may not be longer, viewable 10 or 20 or 200 years from now. Like, just think of film canisters collecting dust 75 years and not being used. Okay, video formats from the 80s, unreadable. We can't look at it. Or you need specialists to actually do it. The half-life of media becomes shorter and shorter. So what you need to think of, if you've created a digital piece, you need to get an external hard drive. The thumb drives are okay, but technically, it's probably more accessible for you to be able to use this and pull information off this for many years to come. After a few years, you may want to take all the data from this and save it to a newer hard drive. Your artwork may not be this important to you, but where I work in the professionally as an illustrator, I need access to older files. So I will, with no problem, purchase hard drives every 3 or 4 years and then save everything over onto a new hard drive. Now, digital art, another way to preserve it is to print it. Now, you have to consider your printer. If you have access to a large printer, that's awesome. Absolutely print your work as large as you can. Hopefully you know about the pixels per square inch and the digital formatting that goes along with creating a digital piece. For instance, if you created a drawing on, let's say, Adobe Photoshop, and you saved it out at 100 dpi, which is dots per inch, and you want to blow this up to maybe 4 foot by 6 foot, you're going to notice that your drawing becomes very blurry. Now, all of these things are aspects of creating something digitally that artists need to know. We did not cover all these specifics in this course. We approached each medium from a very light standpoint, just touching down on them. So these are things you need to consider for the future. Large printers can print your work if you've saved it out in a higher resolution, and then you can take that work, of course, and you can go and frame it. That's a good way to preserve your work. Digitally, you created a piece of art, you printed it, it's finished, and it's framed. Now, you can make multiple pieces like this. That's the wonder of creating digitally. Of course, you want to think about a few options that you have with your school. Your school sometimes have access to a digital printer, so if they do, then be sure and use that. So we've covered and touched the best we can on the ways to preserve all of our artwork that we've created, the different mediums, and hopefully this helps you in understanding that your work, after you've taken so long to create it, you truly need a way to preserve it. So as you can see, preparing and preserving your work, there's a lot to it, more than just maybe putting it in the corner. Now, those of you who went through this course, you created something, you're proud of it, but it's not anything maybe you want to use in the future or share. That's okay too. But a lot of students who take this course in high schools throughout the region, they want to go on to art school or study art in some capacity after high school. Those of you that maybe meet that criteria, well, this course is designed to help you understand how to formulate an idea, put together a composition, prepare and plan for your piece, draw or put together or paint your piece, and then preserve your piece for public display as well. It's all here compacted together. So thanks again for taking the course. Again, this is Section 4, Unit 1. We'll move on now next to Unit 2. I'm Christopher Epling. Until next time, keep drawing.